With the COVID side of stuff, it was like a steamroller that just went through the whole education system. And that's when I went from being like the golden boy of the British education system to a pariah, because I started to speak out, and then things changed. There will be people whispering about things. I've been talking about things with just literally one other person, and they've been whispering. I've said, "What are you doing that for?" But literally, it's just us. So there's this really creepy Orwellian climate of fear around speaking out. Stand up and speak out, because waiting for somebody else to magically get it sorted for you, or for hoping that it's going to go away, isn't going to happen.
I'm Dr. Andy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with me Mike Fairclough, and he is the UK's most outspoken headmaster, and by virtue of that, a headmaster no longer. He's a writer, an author, a brave man, and he's, in a sense, the ideal father figure. So he's trying to instill, I think, I don't want to misspeak, but instill an appropriate masculinity for his lieges, both in school and at home, and trying to, I think, come up with a better type of society than one we have currently. You tell me how far off I am, Mike.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I mean, it's not really just masculinity that concerns me in terms of what I put my energy into. I have 4 biological children of my own. There's my eldest is 28. He turned 28 on Sunday, and his wife's just given birth to my first grandchild as well, called Alice, who's now 3 months old. Thank you. She's absolutely lovely. And then I have a 20-year-old son as well, and then 2 8-year-old twin daughters. And so along with my wife, who's a lady called Sandeep Satara, and she's from the Punjabi Indian community and the Sikh community, which is very much about empowerment, and from its roots, it's actually about freedom fighting. That culture were like fighting the Mughals back in the day. So we're both very much into empowering our daughters to be able to be strong in the same way as we raised our boys. So both boys are resilient, they're physically fit, they're critical thinkers, and it feels like we've empowered them so that they've been able to go into adulthood, being able to stand up and speak out and all that kind of stuff. And it's the same with the girls. And it was interesting, actually, that before I had daughters, I didn't realise the sort of thought processes that I'd go through regarding this. So I've taught children for nearly 30 years now. In fact, it is 30 years. 1995, I qualified as a teacher, and then I spent the next sort of 10 years as a teacher and deputy head teacher, and then I became a headmaster in 2004 and led a school of 365 children, both boys and girls, of 7 to 11-year-olds. But it's only really since I've had my own daughters that things have ramped up in terms of, okay, what do they need to be able to do as well in terms of making them specifically empowered as females, as girls, and then becoming women in the future. But in terms of my educational philosophy, it's based upon this thing called character education. So, and that's inspired in part by something called positive psychology, which is looking at our strengths rather than our areas for development. And it feels a bit like education really emphasizes people's weaknesses a lot and amplifies things like anxiety as if that's something that can like magically disappear. And I think that's an impossible task and probably not even a desirable one. There's a reason why we have anxiety. It's a tool. But the way to, the sort of antidote for it is to move beyond the comfort zone on a regular basis, a daily basis, preferably. And that's my philosophy regarding my parenting and also my educational ethos. And I've done that historically through a number of different means. So, the school that I ran from 2004 through to 2022, we had a farm attached to the school, and on the farm had a herd of water buffalo, herd of sheep, chickens, ducks, all sorts of things. And along with my colleagues, I taught the children to shoot 410 shotguns, air rifles. Every child would learn to light a fire and cook over an open fire. This was all in parallel with the normal state education, so English, math, science, history, geography, etc. But we found that having children outside in all weathers, sub-zero temperatures, and battling against the wind and all that kind of stuff, they would build a sort of resilience which was transferable to the classroom. So children who would be quite sort of timid and underconfident in writing, for example, would have a go at it, having battled against the elements outside. So it feels like when we've achieved something psychologically or then sort of physically and mentally, we've gone beyond our comfort zones, we've achieved something, it gives us a sense of empowerment and strength, which we can then transfer into other realms. And that's essentially the basis of my philosophy.
Excellent. So your sons did well. Congratulations. I've got, I don't have the two younger daughters. I've got the two older sons. My guys are 33 and 29. And if I do the math right, they were born 33 and 29 years ago. Anyway, simpler time. But it's funny, we kind of release them out into the schools, and we trust the schools to do their school thing. My folks, for better for worse, they had me and my brother go to a private, what you would call public, a private high school, starting seventh grade, 7th through 12th. And I would never have thought of doing it. My older brother kind of came up with this idea. He wanted to go to this place. It's called Harasses School in New York City. And it's kind of an elite non-boarding, it's an elite day school. And it's fairly local. It's only like a mile or two from my house. We lived in a tiny kind of one-bedroom rent-controlled apartment, and my parents kind of basically put all their money towards better home or anything else towards the schooling thing. And I didn't think much of it at the time. It was an all boys school, and I guess it was rigorous, but it was just whatever came. I only wanted to go because I didn't want him to go and get ahead of me. It was only, I had no concept of what this school would do for me. So I suppose I have to thank my brother for that. But conversely, here we moved into a suburb, nice leafy suburb right outside of Boston, known for its schools, all kind of stuff. And in the aggregate, maybe it did have some kind of good reputation along the way. But I think there's been a huge falling off in standards in the schools. And so I don't want to diatribe much more than this, but to point out that, what we take as, the schools is an amorphous topic. And I think the schools here, I don't know about your neck of the woods, but in the U.S., they've been subverted, diverted, perverted, and hopefully maybe someday reverted to the basic standards. I remember I did public school for the first 6, 7 grades, and we kind of had basically a foundational, mild reverence for the the freedom and liberties of the U.S. We learned basic topics. We didn't learn gender ideology. We didn't learn kind of activism politics. And my kids, when they were there during kind of the George W. Bush era, for art class, I'll just give one example. For art class, they basically were told to, make posters, screw George Bush, F Bush, no blood for oil kind of stuff, and make these things so they could go out and be activists. That's not art class. That's not teaching them technique. It's not teaching them impressionism, and so forth. So there's not a question there, but maybe you want to carry this rugby ball down the field.
100%. So just to explain, I'm very privileged to have had parents who grew up in the war years in Britain. So my now dead father was 10 years old when he lived in the city of Manchester, and he was born to World War to Irish immigrants, and so he was 10 years old, and the Blitz was going on. So the Germans were flying over and dropping bombs on Manchester, and he wasn't evacuated like my mother, who was from a different background. She was a more affluent background, so she was evacuated to Canada. Although nonetheless, her ship was still torpedoed by the Germans on the way. So it's like, but my father. He said that he remembered hearing the bombs dropping, and he was kind of excited by this. And he would also listen to stories from his father, my paternal grandfather, who fought in the trenches in World War One. So my dad's dad was in the Cameron Highlanders. He fought against the Germans in a kilt in the Battle of the Somme. For the Cameron Highlanders. So I grew up with these kind of stories of grit and resilience. It was all old school British stuff. It was like, if you fell over and hurt yourself, you just get up and brush yourself off and get on with it. And I think that kind of put me in good stead, really, for life, because the reality of life is it's hard, isn't it? And we incur hits and losses in many different forms, and that might include, like in my example, I've had quite a number of close personal bereavements. So, for example, my first wife and the biological mother of my two eldest boys, and I say biological mother because my second wife, Sunday, became their mother after her death. But that close death was probably the most challenging experience in my life, and I've had other ones which have been very close as well. But I think unless I'd been brought up with this sort of resilience, and it's an interesting thing. It's not about not feeling any emotions or expressing pain or anything, but it's about carrying on rather than giving up, I think, essentially. And because I came from that background, and my schooling was really about that as well, because actually in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't woke. We didn't have there wasn't woke ideology at all. I mean, I think it was probably always fairly left leaning, but I don't think it was anything like it is now in terms of the sort of identity politics that's advocated. And I've noticed, so for example, when I took over my school in 2004, became a teacher and a head teacher, and I was teaching my children to shoot guns. Now, I think if I were to do that, I think there would be a massive scandal about it all. It would be like, oh my God, what's going on? Whereas at the time, apart from one negative article in the Daily Mail, that was the one and only negative article, after which they completely celebrated my approach. The public were in favour of it, because lots of members of the public who then subsequently saw also had lots and lots of media exposure in The Guardian, well, that was an amazing one as well. The Guardian, believe it or not, celebrated this head teacher giving guns to kids. You'd never get that now. But something shifted. And it was, I think, I mean, I should really kind of work out, try and pin down when exactly it was, but it feels like it was about maybe 5 years ago. No, it can't be. It must have been more, maybe 8 years, because 5 years was the pandemic. It's amazing how quickly time goes. So it was about 2 years before the pandemic. So let's say 7 years. I noticed this narrative shift in terms of what was being discussed within schools, and it came in the form of the sort of courses that teachers and head teachers were invited to attend. It came in the form of the sorts of discussions that were discussed in the media. And it was very much centered around this idea of mental health, which on the surface sounds good, but it wasn't something that was spoken about before. I mean, obviously, we've always wanted children to be happy and to be able to be emotionally resilient. And we've always spoken about emotional intelligence, for example. But this idea that somehow their children could be deficient, I think that's the key thing. There's this like deficiency. Somehow there were weaknesses, and it was, and then you started to find jobs were created within the education system to plug these gaps. So there'd be the school counsellor suddenly appeared, and people actually with no qualifications to do these roles at all. It was just like, yeah, I'll do that. And somebody would then be being a sort of an amateur psychiatrist for children with sometimes complex needs. And usually it was children who were coming from backgrounds where there were domestic problems, which again, I don't really think the people within the education system were equipped to really do anything about. I mean, it should be a kind of multi-agency approach, but I don't think it should be a thing where one person decides, oh, okay, this is what you need to do to be happy, for example, or even that's necessarily the desired outcome. What we should be doing, and what I've found has been useful in my life, has been to empower children, to make them strong, so that when things do happen, they've got skills to be able to equip them. So I noticed that change. Then at the same time, suddenly there was this talk of gender identity, which I remember when it first happened, and I was thinking, what are you even talking about? Boys can be girls, girls can be boys. I'd come across adults who within my lifetime who had been I mean, we used to call people like transvestites or transsexuals or whatever, and one of the people like his friend was like born a female. This was about 40 years ago, and then identified as a guy. But this was pre kind of the big narrative push where somehow everyone could possibly be in the wrong body. So I've never had a problem. I'm like, yeah, cool, whatever anyone wants to do is fine with me, and I mean that genuinely. But it's this. There was suddenly this pushing it within schools that started to make me feel a bit uneasy. And I remember being on a course with all of my colleagues, and it was run by the local authority who run my school, who sort of like they fund the school from the government basically. And there was a guy there who was saying that we should use gender neutral terms when addressing boys and girls. So no longer should we say boys and girls, we should say something gender neutral like folks. And I refused to do that, and I said, look, I'm not going to do that. I don't. And when I was challenged on it, I said that in my opinion, this is what creates division rather than it. So I think all of this stuff is presented as being about inclusion and tolerance and acceptance, which are all cool things. I think that's good to be accepting of other people. But when it's presented in a way which actually excludes others, and in this case, boys and girls, then it actually creates division. So that's when I started to get a little bit skeptical about the whole thing. But it was only really when COVID hit and I saw how quickly this otherwise nurturing environment of, we call them primary schools in Britain, so 6 through to 11 years of age, that's a primary school, and mine's a junior school, so it's from 7 to 11-year-olds. Usually nurturing and there for the children and all the rest of it, and seeing how quickly kids were just thrown under a bus during that time, and secondary school children as well. So teenagers who go to what you would call high school in America, where they were made to wear masks every day, and take COVID tests and everything. And for me, that just showed me that suddenly they'd gone from this sort of nurturing environment where, even with all of the kind of gender stuff, it felt like, okay, even if people were um, it felt like some people were coming from a place which was genuine, but even if it was misguided, with the COVID side of stuff, it was like a steamroller that just went through the whole education system. And that's when I went from being like the golden boy of the British education system to a pariah, because I started to speak out, and then things changed.
Things. Uh, the American Revolution is looking like a better and better deal all the time. We actually, when you're talking about that in school, you guys learn English. Well, we learned English too. It should be American, I guess, because we speak. What did Winston Churchill said? That it was two peoples divided by a common language. So it's kind of funny. For the most part, we deal pretty well. I was in England a year ago. But that might have been the golden times. I have a friend who comes on fairly frequently, Daniel Jupp, Jupp, and he writes a Substack called Jupplandia for people who want to follow. He wrote The Gates of Hell about Bill Gates, and he's on basically team, lockdown resistance and squish resistance and socialism resistance and so forth. I don't know how long he's going to be able to go saying the things he needs to say and being the vituperative vocal voice that he is. But in general, it seems like the flame of liberty is being extinguished, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. And so it's this kind of a frying pan fire problem. He, for instance, I'm not sure how you are, but he ideally, I guess, would have been a conservative, Tory, whatever. But the Tories were disappointing. Maybe except for Andrew Bridgen, and he's gone from Parliament, and he's been on my program as well. I actually had both of them on together at one point. Anyway, so everyone kind of stayed away from the Tories in droves, and what did you get? Well, you got something worse. Now, can UK survive? 4.5 years or whatever the quotient that Keir Starmer et al. Might get without having to call for elections. And, just to kind of close with this concept, H.L. Mencken, who was kind of the next generation of Mark Twain in the U.S., he once said, democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. So all the people who stayed away from Rishi Sunak, they got Keir Starmer. Now, is there some, third generation of party? Is Nigel Farage the answer? Is there not any answer? Does the Overton window get reconfigured so the Conservatives come back in a Trumpian way or whatever? I don't know, whether you want to inject politics into this, but politics, even
100%. It's all about politics. So first of all, it makes no difference whether it's Tory, there's the Conservative Party, or Labour. The government, we've got our own deep state, and Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, said this recently in America when she went on tour there. I mean, I don't think she's any better, but she said our deep state is older than the United States deep state. And it really, for me, this was a wake-up call back in 2020 when I started being censored on the internet for my opposition to the COVID vaccines for children, and later discovered that I had been monitored by the government's counter-disinformation unit. And once I kind of collaborated with various mainstream media people, journalists, barristers, people from reputable professions who were in the sort of freedom movement, we started making freedom of information requests to departments such as the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, etc., and discovered that there was a whole host of different mechanisms in place which forms what's now been called the censorship industrial complex. So we had the counter disinformation unit, the rapid response unit, it was discovered that MI5 and MI6 were working in liaison with the counter-disinformation unit, had this ridiculous unit. They're still all in operation, by the way, called the 77th Brigade, which is a unit of the British Army. There's also a unit of the Royal Air Force as well, who were all monitoring UK domestic citizens and seeing if they were saying anything that was controversial regarding the government's pandemic response. So that anything from like being anti-lockdown to like questioning the need to vaccinate kids or anything like that at all. And it didn't just target people on the right; it was those on the left as well. It was anyone who was critical of the government's COVID response. And that was an interesting time because the Conservative Party had always, and Boris Johnson in particular, had always like positioned himself as an advocate for free speech, and yet here they were, being part of the most draconian anti-free speech political movement in modern British history, and really going for the jugular. So I was reported as an extremist, for example, to the counter-disinformation unit, but also I was reported as a potential terrorist to the government's anti-terror program called Prevent. So, and this was all whipped up, by the way, with the help of something called the Psychological Nudge Unit. So there's a unit within government which is there to steer public opinion and move people in different kind of directions. And all of these mechanisms have been there for a long time. These groups and these organisations have been there for a long, long time. But they've usually been directed at actual adversaries like terrorists, like ISIS and Al Qaeda and the IRA and things like that. But all of them were eyes off the Islamic terrorists and eyes on the domestic population. So that was an eye opener. But then so first of all, with Labour being voted in, it wasn't a landslide election. We've got 65 million people in the United Kingdom, and I think that includes kids, and I think it was 45 million, I'm not sure if that's the exact figure, but it was around that, who didn't vote at all. So most people didn't vote. And then out of, I think it was something like between 8 and 9 million people who voted Labour, which is our current government, and the others who voted combined outperformed Labour. So you had Conservative voters who was about 4 million or something.
It's first past the gate.
And then, yeah, exactly. And then there's a party called Reform as well. That's Nigel Farage's party, which I did vote Reform in the last election. And by the way, just to nail my colours to the mast, I was also one of those who voted to leave the European Union. I'm a Brexiteer as well, which didn't go down particularly well with my education colleagues either, who are all like Remain. But anyway, however, I feel quite disillusioned with Reform as well, because there's a fantastic member of Parliament called Rupert Lowe, who was in Reform, and he's now essentially been kicked out and hounded. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, what I can say for a fact is that the attack on free speech is doubling down massively. So there are, on average, 30 people arrested for social media posts a day in the UK for saying something which is potentially hurtful. So if you've hurt somebody's feelings or something, you'll get a knock on the door and you can be taken away. That's included, by the way, I've got somebody who's been a fabulous supporter of mine called Alison Pearson, who's a senior columnist for The Telegraph, and she supported me throughout my COVID campaigning. And she was investigated by the police for what they said was an offensive tweet that she wrote a year ago. And yet when they tried to identify what the tweet was, they weren't able to do that. So she was told she was under investigation. It was only when Elon Musk stepped in and said, oh, this is totalitarian, and Britain slipping into this sort of dystopian Orwellian kind of climate of free speech. It's only when that happened that they dropped the investigation. Another very great supporter of mine, and who I've supported as well, called Bernie Spofforth, a very successful businesswoman. She was actually arrested for making comments after the Southport massacre of 3 little children by an Islamist terrorist, and she was incarcerated for 3 days. I mean, this was a successful businesswoman, and it wasn't an outrageously provocative post at all. But lots of people have been hammered, and most recently there's been this situation with a lady who also said some things after the massacre, and that it was inappropriate and inflammatory what she said. However, she went for a walk after she'd made these statements, because she was very upset about these little girls being murdered, and she'd written something. She came back after her walk, calmed down, and deleted the post. Nonetheless, because she had thought about this stuff and expressed it, and then thought better of it and removed it, she was arrested, and now she's in prison for nearly 3 years. So they are doubling down big time on anyone who says anything that, according to the government, is offensive. So it doesn't have to be something that is they decide what it is. So we've also had, so for example, during the times when we had lots of protests against Israel for the bombing of the Gaza Strip, there were lawful and peaceful protests in London, and there were also pro-Hamas protests. And during those protests, there were people on those protests with the police all around them saying things like "kill the Jews." Now, none of those people were arrested. None of them have been imprisoned.
No, it's
so it doesn't matter what you think about the Gaza Strip. It's what we're calling two-tier policing and two-tier justice system. So if you
two-tier tier, I mean, literally, I think that's being enshrined. That if you're, I guess, ancestral English, whatever, you're expected more of, and you're going to get worse punishments than others. I mean, it's a racial, ethnic, whatever kind of justice system now. It's crazy.
And what it does is it creates division. So I'm married to an Indian, a British Asian Indian, and none of the family or any of the community that I connect with have think that this is good, what's going on. And it's interesting. I think it's more of a white middle class agenda rather than actually the British Asian one. British Asians are actually socially conservative. So like, for example, in my wife's, when I've gone to London and gone to the temple, this happened the last time I went there. They were all Trump supporters. They're not. None of them are left wing at all. So this idea that somehow if you're brown skinned you've got to be, there must be all like left wing and everything. It's not at all. It's the opposite. And what it does is it creates division, because of course then people who, particularly the white working class, who tend to be the victims of this sort of two-tier policing, but with the exception of quite a number of people. Alison Pearson isn't working class. She's, I mean, she was originally, but she's like now, I guess, middle class, a high-ranking, reputable journalist. This professional millionaire businesswoman that was spoken about. They were arrested and investigated, etc. So it spans classes, but it does predominantly seem to be directed at anyone who is on the right of politics. But going back to what I was saying regarding the Conservatives, they are no better. So during the pandemic, they were the ones who instigated all of those counter-disinformation unit, rapid response unit, directed the intelligence agencies against the people, etc. And the whole thing has just basically been ramped up under Labour. And I feel that it's although I can't prove anything, there's a guy called Dominic Cummings who was the chief advisor to Boris Johnson from 2019 through to November 2021, and he was one of the sort of chief architects of lockdown and all of that kind of stuff. And he has recently come out. Well, I say recently. It was. I think it was December last year, so sort of 3 months or 4 months, and said that the people who you see on the television, the Prime Minister and senior ministers in Westminster leading the country, it's just a veneer, and that behind them are people whose names most people wouldn't know or recognise at all, and they are the ones who really run the country. So it seems to me that that's essentially what it is. And I wonder as well whether that's also possibly true for America. And the reason, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are about this, because I was so excited with the whole Make America Healthy Again movement, and I still am. And Robert Kennedy has given me personal encouragement over the last 3 years in emails and things. People like Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Bhattacharya, I have a connection with as well, and we've connected. And so on and so forth, and so I think there's wonderful people there. But the fact, I'd be just interested to hear what you say about this. The fact that the COVID vaccines have not, and particularly haven't been removed from the childhood vaccine schedule, indicates to me that it's a similar situation to Britain, where the sort of underbelly of government, which you don't really see, is possibly more powerful than the people who are supposed to be in charge. What do you think about that?
Well, it's every now and then we go to the beach, and there are different beaches. Some of them seem to be shaped so there's an undertow. So you go for some harmless activity, you think you're just going to get a little dip and swim and cool down and lie on the beach, get a little bit of a tan. But sometimes there's an undertow. Sometimes there are sharks. What you normally think of just as the pleasant beach can have issues. People can drown, and this is this undertow that pulls you out. Why is there an undertow? I don't know. It's kind of built into certain types of beach, the shape of the waves, the size of the waves, how they come in. What am I talking about? Well, we kind of conceive government to be this nice little beach, a very standard place. We're used to it. We get some solace, we get some benefit from it, so forth. But there are sharks there, and there's an undertow. And now, I'm not saying that the ocean has a sensibility and a mind, but certainly government individuals do. And whatever's out there can be used, and it can be misused, and can be abused. So I personally think that humans are endeavoring, creative, gaming, conniving individuals. And, the reason we've had religions for so often, for so long and so much, is that humans can do dastardly things. And if we want to have some kind of compact and a pact together to not get at each other's throats and not have, huge divisive tribalism and worse, is that we have certain standards and rules. So at the beach, mind you, there are going to be some rules. They see a shark, they tell you not to do this. There's an undertow, don't go out now. There are going to be some tides, a tsunami, whatever. There are times not to go out on the beach. So we have a kind of a reasonable skepticism of the beach that we didn't perhaps have towards government. So maybe if nobody wants shark bites and whatnot, but a few instances of these, well, I stopped putting my finger in the electrical outlets when I was a kid, and I stopped touching the oven because I had a reaction to those bad events. I think what we've seen, COVID was, to kind of make some more crazy metaphors, COVID was the canary in the coal mine that showed us that government is not always there to help. Ronald Reagan back in the 80s said, the worst lines you ever want to hear is, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. These are not necessarily, standard issues. I mean, they don't necessarily align. And the way you were talking about schools and whatnot is the same thing. These are things that we have, like the beach, we assume are there for our good. I blithely sent my kids to public schools. I wasn't really paying much attention for the most part because they're kids and they're learning how to read and write. They come out, they generally know how to read and write when they're done certain levels of grades. But the extra sauce, that kind of stuff that was there for them. The schools, in a sense, are there for the teachers. They've expanded those roles. The number of ancillary non-teacher roles has ballooned. When I went back in the Neanderthal Paleozoic era of schooling in the 1960s, we had pretty much teachers. That was it. We had 30 kids per class. We had a teacher, one teacher, and we had a principal, an assistant, a nurse, and a secretary. That was it. And now, if you look at the roster of schools in the U.S., the number of non-teachers outnumber the number of teachers. Now, this has been very, very good for teachers. It's been good for their pensions, it's been good for their jobs, and so forth. So all these vehicles can be overloaded and overlarded with waste. And now it's not waste for them, because these things are very lucrative sinecures. They're jobs that people can have without doing that much work, because they're working for the government. There's not that much oversight. It's the monarchy. Now, the default position of humanity, and maybe other animals and so forth, walruses and ants, is to have a hierarchy. So bees, nobody really questions there's a queen bee. Nobody says, oh, get rid of the queen bee. We're going to have bee democracy. We're going to have ant democracy, walrus democracy. That guy's been the chief walrus for too long. None of these other animals think of this stuff. We have, for better or for worse, because we're thinking creatures and so forth. We have a lot of extra brain space, proportionally towards other, from other animals. So we make these institutions, and then we kind of set them off and assume they're going to be okay. This is a mistake. You can fly a kite, but you have to pay attention to the kite if you want to stay up, and so forth. Maybe not be that much effort. So I think we got lazy, and we presumed that the beach is just a nice place. We forgot about the sharks. We forgot about the undertow and so forth. And again, nobody wants to be bitten by a shark, but a few shark bites will remind us that the beach is someplace that you have to have reasonable caution. And ditto the schools, ditto the government, and so forth. And those are made of humans also, and they have the same kind of acquisitive, rapacious, craven, greedy tendencies. And greed is not the worst thing. So Milton Friedman said that greed is when other people want things. When you want things, it's because you have ambition. So it's reasonable to have ambitions. And the American Revolution, getting back to ours, was to hold all those ambitions in check, appositionally and oppositionally, from and towards and away from each other. So everybody knows that people are going to want things, and the idea is that you have enough checks and balances, nobody gets away with that much. Now, the deep state is, basically the concept is it's a hidden element, and it's a subversion. So nobody would have been shocked if Louis the 14th, 15th, or 16th had a deep state. Okay, because that's what that was. That's what they were supposed to do. They're supposed to be conniving, so because they were a minority. There aren't that many royalties, royals compared to the rest of the population. You guys have had it all over Europe, and again, that might be very much the default position of humanity, as well as ants, walruses, and whatnot. So that might be what we're doing. We slide back into it unless we're vigilant. We want something better, and again, we have civilization, so we're not walruses and whatnot. We make clothing, we have houses, we get to stay out of the elements, we get to do what we want, we get to listen to music, all that kind of stuff. So if you want to have the liberty to do that stuff as much as you can, you have to kind of consider that the some of those unseen elements need to be seen, and they are subverted for their own good. So what happens with the deep state? I don't know how conniving they are, but I do think they're protective of their little rent-seeking, rent-sought luxuries. And so they want to keep their jobs forever. And what we see, we're having these hands-off rallies in the U.S. where people are protesting the fact that bloat is being exposed. Well, if it's bloat for your family and it's bloat for your favorite party, it's not bloat. It's progressivism, whatever. So, this has become its own ballast, its own, mechanism and so forth. And people just pay it to a certain point. There's other metaphor, you put the lobster in the water or the frog in the boiling water, he doesn't notice it for a while till it's really hot. By then it's too late. And so, I think we were rescued, God bless him. I think Elon Musk, has done more for humanity. I mean, I'm a Donald Trump fan, and he's done a lot. He literally put his life on the line a few different times and so forth. And when you're over, you get shot at when you're over the target. Elon Musk is by proxy getting shot at and fire bombed and whatnot, and it's not he just yet, but God forbid that happens. But you have to put your gonads on the line at some point and make a stand. And when that happens, generally speaking, the other forces recede. There's that Tiananmen Square man. I don't know what happened to him. Puts his hand up, kind of put the finger in the turret gun of the tank. Now, he wound up, I'm sure, getting executed and so forth, but the image is powerful. That image is what scares the tyrants. And so it's
Yeah.
bravery is the antidote, is the vaccine for deep statism. And it requires
Absolutely. And this brings us back to, so your question about going back to the free speech situation of free speech within Britain, that's exactly what the antidote is. So it's not about hoping for a savior in the form of a politician, actually, although it would be fantastic. And there are some great ones, like you mentioned, Andrew Bridgen, Rupert Lowe, there was a guy called Danny Kruger. There's a few people who've stood up and who've been either in Westminster or who are currently in Westminster, who are great. But the real power is from the people. Now, it's specifically being able to, this is where I feel like my training from my, like, being raised by my parents who lived through, a world war, and having a grandfather who was in World War One, and all of the kind of stuff that I've been through, the deaths, etc. That has made me realise that it's important and necessary to put my self-preservation on the back burner, and to put self-sacrifice as the primary objective. And that's the thing that I think that a lot of people, sadly, they do it the other way around. They prioritize self-preservation ahead of self-sacrifice. And within my situation, I was the only head teacher or school principal out of 43,500 in the entire United Kingdom. That's England, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland and Wales. The only one to question the COVID vaccine rollout to children. And that's not because I was brave or because I wasn't absolutely terrified as I was doing it, because I was. And it's not because I didn't take complete hits and losses. In fact, I went from being a highly successful and highly regarded head teacher to becoming a delivery guy. That's what ended up happening. I'm not anymore. My writing has taken off, and I'm making more money now than I did as a head teacher. But for several months, I was delivering vegetables, ironically, to the schools that I used to advise. And I remember when the first day that I did it, I was shadowing a guy, because I thought I was going to be delivering flowers to florists. I don't know how I made that mistake, but anyway, I got into this van, and the guy said, "Right, it's vegetables, carrots, potatoes, da da da," and he said, "Right, so anyway, the first school that we're going to go to is X." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, that's what we do. We deliver fruit and vegetables to schools." And I honestly thought I was dreaming. I actually thought I was in a dream, and I had this really otherworldly kind of experience. And sure enough, that's what I was doing. It's like, wow, this is really intense. And for 2 days, I was feeling like a victim, really. And it was my wife who, after 2 days of that, she just had enough. She said, "Look, suck it up, like, walk your talk. This is like, you're obviously doing this for a reason." And then I embraced it, and I actually really enjoyed the job, and I liked doing physical work, and it was really cool to get up early and do sort of hard graft. And it felt like it felt like a spiritual experience, to be honest with you. It was like this, I had to be doing that for some reason. I'm still processing it now. But anyway, the point being, I got to the point where financially I was nearly ruined because of what happened, and I took hits and losses on every single front. However, I was one cog in a wheel of lots of different people who were pushing against the vaccine rollout to kids in the United Kingdom. So to the point where, in the end, 89.5% of 5 to 11-year-olds didn't receive a single shot. So we were successful. We achieved the goal. So some of us took hit. Well, most of us did, like the doctors did, who I'm in touch with, and some of the journalists. We all got blacklisted and cancelled, and this, that, and the other. But this. And part of this actually was I started looking at the idea of the hero's journey, and reading Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and I ended up writing my fourth book. Actually, was inspired by this, and thinking, how can it be so hard? And then I realised that that's the point. Unless something is really, really hard and you might not make it, unless you're in that space, you're not on a quest. That is what defines a quest. You want a quest to be easy and to feel like you're the hero, and it's like you come out the other side in all shiny and glory. But unless you nearly don't make it, and unless you take some serious, serious hits, it's not actually a quest. And through that process, one also gains insights which you wouldn't get in any other situation. And I should have known better, because I'd been through, as I said before, bereavements where they were incredibly painful, but which were enriching as well, which sounds strange, but it's like with the death of my first wife, that was the most painful thing I've ever experienced, but it was the most enlightening experience as well, because it taught me about life, it taught me about love, it taught me about mortality, it took away my fear of death, all sorts of things which would never have happened had I not been through that experience. And the same level of profound insights happened through this journey as well. I learned so much about myself and about other people. And as I said, the main thing was realizing that you don't grow unless you feel that pain. You've got to move through some kind of comfort
It's
zone.
absolutely right. I mean, I mentioned the sticking your finger in the outlet or putting your hand on the stove. Those are quick learning experiences, so you avoid those certain things. But the other ones you're talking about are, really, as you say, the hero's journey. And there's no hero's journey without basically defeats, I guess. You have temporary defeats before you have your ultimate victory. It's all the sweeter then. On a personal basis, I suffered, I guess, a suspension in 2014 from the Board of Registration in Medicine in Massachusetts because of an angry narcotic addict, a felon, a heroin dealer, didn't like a little bit of the kind of tough love that I was bringing to him. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but basically I'd met him just that one time, and he was a big, hale and hearty kind of guy, 6'3". We still use the English system, 250 pounds, and he could have flicked me off with his finger. But he was selling drugs at the same time he was on disability from General Electric. And, I was trying to have him square the circle. He was coming in for a detox to get off the narcotics via Suboxone, which itself is a narcotic. And I was really the only doctor maybe one or two others in the whole state offering a scaffolding by which you could climb down from your drug habit. And so that's why he was there. And we talked about that. And I said, look, I can get you off the heroin. I can put you on the Suboxone. But if you really want to stay clean, I think the real issue is underlying. It's a matter of whether you are living an honest life. So you can wake up and look in the mirror and see somebody you like. That's, otherwise you're drugging that. You're trying to smush the mirror because you can't deal with the person you have become. And so he had actually a side business, working on fences. And he was selling the drugs on the side. He was working in his mother's house. He was physically capable of doing things. He had his hands and feet and everything, working. And he's a big guy and he's strong. And he was reasonably skilled because he'd had a job at General Electric and whatnot. But he wanted the disability money coming in so he could, do this other stuff. So there's the good and bad parts. And I'm not a Manichaean, but, just say good and evil. And so I brought this up with him, and he said he got threatened at first. He's like, you're not going to call on my disability. I said, look, no, that's not my job. I'm here to treat you. That stuff's in confidence. But, it's something at some point you want to address because you're going to be a better you. And so I don't know if he felt threatened or whatever. He never came back. The funny thing is, while he was still there, we spent a fair amount. I was spending more time with my patients at that time in these first few visits to kind of get at the underlying issues. And the funny thing is, I had said to him, these things. And then I went to do other stuff. He was going to give a blood test, a urine sample, whatever. So I came back. I kind of grazed the patients because as they're kind of cooking in various rooms, I juggle. And so as I was walking by his room, he called me back in. He's kind of got tears in his eyes. He's a big guy, manly, whatever. He's got tears, and that's not usual. I said, "What is it?" He says, "You're right." I said, "Well, I'm always right, but what am I right about?" And he said, "Well, I'm lazy." He himself, he's saying he is lazy. I'm like, and he's crying about it. He says, you're right about me. I'm lazy." I said, "Well, you know what? That's okay. These are things that when you identify, you can fix, you can work on." And and the funny thing is, he just never came back. He didn't come back for the detox. I never saw him again. And like 3 or 4 months later, he wrote a letter, like a fanciful letter of anger. I must have touched on something. He did cry, whatever. But he wrote this letter that I had like thrown his glasses on the ground. I called him, his wife a dirty name. I'd like hit him in the stomach. I mean, that's crazy stuff. If I'd done any of those things, he would have crushed me like a bug underfoot. I mean, he was big enough to do all those things. And there were 6 or 7 other people in the office at the time. He never said a word. He didn't complain or yell, whatever. Everything was all copacetic at the time, aside from his, emotions. And then he wrote this letter, and the board, kind of in its woke phase, and announcedly so, they kind of promoting this stuff. It was before the word woke was a thing. They kind of went all full. I don't want to misuse the word, but they all went full jihad on me, and I had to like apologize for doing something I never did in the first place, and I wasn't going to. I'm not built for that. And so I went through a kind of a suspension and a difficult era and period and whatnot. But on the other hand, I put everything back together. I got my license back. It took much longer than it should have. I lost my medical practice in the meanwhile. But you work on other things. It gives you kind of an image and I guess a lodestar by which you follow and try to work on other things. You realize that the essence of your life is your name and how you are going to kind of keep that polished. And so the same incident with the childhood vaccines, I literally had my LinkedIn disappear. So this is kind of be in my post-medical, actual, seeing people in primary care phase. I'd done that for 30x years. But in this later phase, I've been doing other things while I was waiting for my license to come back. And since it's been back, I'm still doing those other things. And it's like, it's a matter that you have to get your voice out. You have to say what's there. And you don't want to be jailed or whatever. And I haven't been, but you have to kind of say your stuff. And if you don't do it, then where are you? And so I think that's the real message for people. And we're rounding out the hour, so I'm going to give you last word, and I'll tell people how to find you and so forth. But what are your general thoughts before we?
So that resonates with me because I've spoken about this as being the Britain's unofficial social credit system. So we have a social credit system. So if you speak out about something which is controversial or politically sensitive, you are, and you're have any sort of profile, you will be attacked for it by the state. And that includes the media, so the media arm of the state, and it will do everything it can to ruin your reputation, and as a consequence, it will impact on your finances and so on and so forth. So essentially, to try and just destroy you. And the idea is that sets an example to everyone else, so that the free speech landscape diminishes and shrinks completely, to the point where people don't want to say anything which might be considered controversial, because even in like polite companies, like private company, there will be people whispering about things. I've been talking about things with just literally one other person, and they've been whispering. I've said, "What are you doing that for?" It's just us. So there's this really creepy Orwellian climate of fear around speaking out. But what I've found is, because I've been punished and gone right to the point where everything has almost been destroyed, I actually don't really fear it anymore. And if anything, it emboldens me to speak out about things, and I think that's what people need to realize. We've got to stand up. If you stand up, you are likely to be attacked, and it's better to think, I am going to be attacked. Just realize that is likely, but that if you do so, you are entering into possibly the greatest and most significant quest of our time, because the alternative to stepping out into the quest is doing nothing. And if you do nothing, eventually the perils of the quest will come to your door and they will kick down your door, by which point it is too late. So that's my final word, really. It's like, stand up and speak out, because waiting for somebody else to magically get it sorted for you, or for hoping that it's going to go away, isn't going to happen. And you will be enriched by the experience, even though you will leave with several scars, hits and losses along the way.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. People can find you at x.com at your name. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being on my show.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.